Today in section 3.4, we're going to talk about how nutrients cycle through the biosphere. In the last few sections, we've talked about how energy flows through the ecosystem through food chains and food webs. Now we're going to talk about elements and nutrients that are passed from one organism to another throughout the biosphere through what we call biogeochemical cycles. These cycles recycle the elements through both bio, living, and geo, earth, and they are recycled. These cycles are powered by the energy flow through the ecosystem, but the elements themselves are actually always recycled. The first cycle we're going to talk about is the water cycle. The main source of water in the atmosphere is from water vapor evaporating from the ocean or other bodies of water. Another source of water in the atmosphere is through a process called transpiration, and this is where water actually evaporates from the leaves of plants. We have precipitation that flows along the surface, and that's called runoff, entering rivers or streams, carried to the ocean, and also entering into the groundwater. Groundwater then enters into plants, uptake through their roots, or it can also flow into rivers, streams, and oceans. Groundwater can also penetrate deeply enough to enter the underground reservoir, also called the aquifer. The nutrient cycles that we're going to be talking about include the way that carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycle through the biosphere. And all of these are nutrients that are essential for every organism to build tissues and carry out its functions of life. Oxygen is another important nutrient in the ecosystem, and oxygen does not have its own separate cycle, but it is part of the carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycle because it combines with those things. The other way that oxygen is important is because it is released by photosynthesis, the most important or one of the most important biological activities, and then it's also used during cellular respiration by all organisms. Multicellular organisms, plants, animals, you, me, everything, and as well many single-cell organisms use oxygen. So the first of the nutrient cycles we'll talk about is the carbon cycle. Plants take in carbon dioxide during photosynthesis and use the carbon to build carbohydrates like glucose. We've talked about that one before. Those carbohydrates passed on then through the food web. Organisms like you and I release carbon in the form of carbon dioxide by our cellular respiration. So the biological cycle of taken in by plants and released by the cellular respiration. When organisms die, decomposers break down their organisms, and then the carbon that was stored in their body is released back to the environment. Geologic forces that come into play here are where the carbon from dead and decaying organisms can be turned into fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas, and as well as the carbon from marine sediments and the shells of marine organisms turned into carbonate-based rocks like the kind we have here in Missouri. We call it limestone. The remainder of the carbon cycle talks about the ways carbon dioxide can be released back into the atmosphere, and that can be through volcanic activity as well as human burning of fossil fuels, and when the forests are clear cut and burned, all that carbon then is released into carbon dioxide. Next, we'll talk about the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is important to all living things because nitrogen is essential to make amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, and it is also important in making nucleic acids, which are the building blocks of DNA. The thing to remember about the nitrogen cycle is that there are different forms of nitrogen, and depending on what form you have, depends on what it can do. So nitrogen gas, this form N2, makes up 78% of our atmosphere, so there's a lot of it. And then there are also nitrogen-containing substances, ammonia, nitrate, and nitrite, and those are forms of nitrogen found in the soil, found in waste product, and also dead and decaying materials. There is also dissolved nitrogen that is found in the ocean and in other large bodies of water. So we have nitrogen in the soil as well as in water. There are only a few kinds of bacteria that can actually use atmospheric nitrogen. And these bacteria live in the soil and on the roots of some kinds of plants. These plants are called legumes. And a good example of a legume is soybeans. The bacteria that live in the soil and on the roots of soybeans are able to convert nitrogen gas from the air into ammonia. So they can take the nitrogen in the air and convert it into nitrogen in the soil. And this is called nitrogen fixation. Other bacteria in the soil take that nitrogen and then convert it into a form that our producers can use. So they take that ammonia nitrogen and convert it into the nitrate and nitrite form of nitrogen, and then those plants can use it and then passed on to consumers and then to make their own nitrogen containing compounds in proteins and DNA. Decomposers play an important role in the nitrogen cycle because the nitrogen in waste and dead and decaying organisms is broken down and released back into the soil. So that then, once it's in the soil, producers, grass, trees, can use it again by absorbing it through the roots. There's another kind of bacteria that takes the nitrate and in the soil and converts it back into nitrogen gas. So we take the nitrogen in the soil and give it back to the atmosphere, and this is called denitrification. So we remove the nitrogen from the soil in the form that plants can use and return it back to the atmosphere. A small amount of the nitrogen in the air can also be converted into the soil form or usable form of nitrogen through lightning. Humans add nitrogen to the cycle by taking atmospheric nitrogen and produce fertilizer. So we add that to the soil. But excess fertilizer and excess nitrates can be carried into the surface water or groundwater, and this can cause problems. Phosphorus is the last cycle we're going to talk about. Phosphorus is found in living organisms as a part of DNA and RNA. So it is a very important biological molecule, but there's really not a lot of it in the biosphere. Phosphorus is found mainly in the form of phosphate, and this is found in the form of phosphate rock. It's found in the soil, and it's also found in the ocean, in marine sediments, as well as dissolved in the ocean water. As rocks and sediments become weathered and wear down, the phosphate trapped in the rock is released and then is available in the land to cycle between the organisms and the soil. Plants and other primary producers are able to absorb the phosphate from the soil and then incorporate it into the organic compounds such as DNA and RNA. Phosphates then in plants move through the food web as cycles through producers to consumers and the rest of the ecosystem. Marine ecosystems also cycle phosphate through them as well. The alga in marine ecosystems absorbs the phosphate and incorporates it into its producer role, and it is passed up through the ecosystems in the same way. All nutrients are necessary for living things to continue growing, and if any nutrient is in short supply, that can cause a definite slowdown of the ecosystem. So it's kind of similar to a gear, and if one of the gears is removed or sticks, then this whole mucks up the whole works. In the soil, plant growth is limited by nutrients such as the nitrogen and phosphorus as well as potassium. So commercial fertilizers add large amounts of these. Also, some micronutrients are added in smaller amounts to increase their supply. In aquatic ecosystems, nutrients are also limited. In ocean ecosystems, nitrogen is often the limiting nutrient, and in freshwater lakes and rivers, phosphorus is the limiting nutrient. And that's all, folks.